The dawn broke soft and silver over Lindisfarne. The monks woke as they always did, to bells, to hymns, to the sound of waves brushing the rocks. Their lives were prayer, patience, and peace. The island was their sanctuary, an outpost of heaven surrounded by cold northern sea. They had no fear of what lay beyond the horizon. But that morning the horizon changed. Black shapes appeared in the mist, low and sharp, gliding across the water like beasts made of wood and iron. At first, they thought traders had come. Then they saw the dragon heads carved on the prows, the shields lining the sides, the flash of steel. Before the bells could ring for warning, it was too late. The longships had come. The Norse had arrived. And on this quiet island of saints, the air would soon burn with screams and smoke. This was the day holiness was broken. The day the north wind carried not blessings but death. The day faith met fury and lost. The monastery of Lindisfarne had always been a world apart, a sacred rhythm untouched by the noise of kings and armies. The monks believed they had built heaven's border on earth. They rose before the sun, washed their faces in cold water drawn from stone basins, and gathered in the chapel, where the first light poured through narrow windows onto their bowed heads. Psalms echoed off the walls, a steady breath between God and man. After prayers came labor, the rhythm of hoes in the garden, the scratch of quills in the scriptorium, the creak of the old presses that bound parchment. Their days were simple, their purpose pure. They lived surrounded by salt air and seagull cries, the endless hiss of the sea like a constant hymn. It was peace made real, fragile and complete. They had no soldiers, no guards, no need for suspicion. The most dangerous intruder they had ever faced was a storm. Even when news came of strange northern raiders attacking distant coasts, it was spoken of like a rumor, not a threat. The monks believed distance and devotion would keep them safe. Their world was ruled by faith, not fear. But that morning, the horizon betrayed them. At first, the sea shimmered like glass under the rising sun. Then came the shapes, small at first, distant dots that moved too swiftly to be fishing boats. Some of the younger brothers thought them traders or pilgrims arriving for blessing. The elder monks shaded their eyes uneasy. The ships were long, narrow, their prows carved like beasts, dragons with snarling jaws that caught the sunlight. The sails were striped red and black, swelling with the wind. There were too many, 10, 12. More emerging from the mist, moving in perfect rhythm. A bell rang once, not for prayer but for alarm. The monks gathered at the shore, robes fluttering in the wind. Some clutched crucifixes. Others simply stood frozen. The first ship struck sand with a shuddering thud, its dragon head towering above them. Then came the sound, the deep drum of shields struck by swords, a roar of voices in a tongue they did not know. The Vikings leapt from their ships like wolves breaking from a pack. They wore leather and chain, iron helmets glinting in the light. Some painted their faces, others bore tattoos that looked like serpents crawling down their arms. Their eyes burned with the kind of fury only hunger and belief could forge. In their world, this raid was not murder. It was destiny, the will of their gods, the proof of strength. The first monk to approach raised a trembling hand, perhaps to offer peace, perhaps to beg. He didn't finish the gesture. The blade split his chest open before he could speak. Blood sprayed across the sand. The others screamed, some running, some falling to their knees in prayer. But the invaders moved like a tide, relentless, roaring, laughing as they cut through robes and bodies alike. The monastery's doors, carved by generations of patient hands, splintered beneath the swing of axes. Candles toppled and rolled across the floor, setting fire to parchment, to wood, to life's work. Flames climbed the walls, consuming centuries of faith in minutes. The smell of burning ink, wax, and flesh mingled into one choking cloud. The golden relics that once shone under candlelight now clattered to the ground, seized by blood-stained hands. The Vikings tore open the reliquaries, scattering bones of saints they did not recognize. To them, these were not holy remains. They were trophies or curiosities. One warrior, laughing, lifted a jeweled cross, turned it in the light, and tore the jewels free with a knife. Others smashed the chalices, melted their edges, pocketed the silver. The monks' sacred texts, each page a masterpiece of devotion, were ripped apart, their gold leaf scraped off, their covers tossed into the fire. Outside, chaos reigned. Those too old or weak to run were cut down where they stood. The young and strong were bound, roped together like animals. The screams of the captured mixed with the crackle of burning wood. The Vikings loaded their ships with treasure, chalices, tapestries, anything that glittered, but they also loaded people. For them, gold was valuable, but human beings were more so. Slaves could be traded, ransomed, or used. As the ships prepared to depart, the beach was littered with the dead. Monks whose lives had been prayer now lay face down in the sand, their blood washing into the sea that once brought them fish and peace. The chapel roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The bell tower melted into silence. The air that once carried hymns now carried the smell of ruin. And yet among the noise and horror, a strange quiet lingered. A silence that wasn't peace, but the shock of disbelief. The survivors, if any, would later write that it felt as though the world itself had been torn open. For the first time, holy ground had been violated by human greed. The monastery that once represented divine order now stood as a monument to its collapse. When the last ship disappeared beyond the waves, the island was left in ashes. The gulls returned, circling the smoke, crying as if mourning the dead. The sea looked calm again, almost beautiful, as though it hadn't just carried murderers to shore. But Lindisfarne would never be the same. Its stones would remember. Its silence would speak for centuries. This was not just the fall of one monastery. It was the beginning of something far greater, an age where faith, fire, and fear would rule the northern world. And from this moment of horror, the legend of the Vikings was born. The smoke of Lindisfarne had barely faded when word began to spread. Messengers carried the tale south through the villages of Northumbria, their faces pale, their voices trembling. Monks who escaped the massacre spoke of demons from the sea, men with iron skin and wolf eyes who showed no mercy, who laughed while slaughtering priests, who tore open churches as if desecrating the body of Christ itself. When the story reached the great halls of kings and bishops, the reaction was disbelief. The idea that holy ground could be touched, that the sacred could be violated so completely, seemed impossible. But the truth was written in blood upon the sand. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the moment with horror. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria, and miserable were the people afflicted. Fiery dragons flew across the sky. Great famine followed. And not long after, the ravages of heathen men destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. To the Christian world, this was not just a raid. It was an omen, a sign that divine protection had been withdrawn. Priests preached that the sins of men had invited the scourge of pagans. Kings ordered prayers, fasts, and penance, hoping to turn aside what they saw as the wrath of heaven. But the real wrath was human, not divine. The Norse expansion had begun. From the fjords of Norway and Denmark, young men looked out across grey seas with hunger in their hearts. They came from lands of rock and pine, where winters bit hard and soil was thin. Population was growing. Ambitious warriors had little room to rise at home, and so they turned outward. The sea became their road, their ships their homes. What began as raiding soon became an industry, fast, profitable, and glorified. To the Norse mind, battle and plunder were not crimes. They were proof of worth, gifts to their gods. Each successful raid meant silver, slaves, and fame. The sagas would one day sing of such men, of those who braved storm and steel for glory. And Christian monasteries were irresistible. They were rich beyond imagining, full of gold and treasure, and yet undefended. Their inhabitants were peaceful, celibate, unarmed. To a Viking, they were both the softest and most rewarding targets imaginable. No walls, no soldiers, no risk. Only wealth, food, women, and slaves. Lindisfarne became the spark that lit centuries of conquest. Soon, more longships began to prowl the coasts of Britain and Francia. The Vikings struck from the sea without warning, vanishing as swiftly as they came. The raid spread terror like wildfire. Monks began fortifying their abbeys, building stone walls, towers, and gates. But few could withstand the fury that came with each summer tide. In the courts of Europe, scholars like Alcuin of York wrote letters filled with dread and disbelief. Serving under Charlemagne, he warned his fellow Christians, "Behold, the pagans have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints, and carried off the treasures of his house." Is this the beginning of the end? To him, the raid was not just a tragedy, it was a revelation. Civilization, he realized, was fragile. Faith alone could not defend it. For the Vikings, it was triumph. For the monks, it was apocalypse. They came again the next year, and the next. Lindisfarne's ashes had not cooled before the island of Iona suffered the same fate. Monasteries that once echoed with chants now rang with screams. Holy books burned. Gold crosses were melted into coins. Sacred relics were stolen and sold in distant markets. Those not killed were enslaved, monks, scribes, and nuns alike. The fury of the north had found its rhythm, and for every raid, the myth of the Vikings grew. Dark, unstoppable, godless. To the faithful, they were beasts in human flesh. To themselves, they were chosen. Touched by the favor of Odin and Thor, they carved fear into Europe's soul. And though kingdoms would rise to fight them, the memory of Lindisfarne, that first night when the sea itself seemed to turn against God, would never fade. The slaughter ended when there was nothing left to take. The gold was stripped, the relics shattered, the chapel burned. But not everyone died. The Vikings spared those who could walk, those young and strong enough to be useful. Chains were hammered from the iron of the monastery's own tools, and wrists once raised in prayer were bound with them. The survivors, monks, servants, and women from nearby religious houses, were forced to kneel in the ashes of their home as their captors laughed and divided them like spoils of war. To the Vikings, people were cargo. Slavery was not an abomination. It was a currency, a way of life woven into their economy. They called their slaves thralls, living property beneath even animals. A thrall could be bought, sold, or killed at a master's whim. They were expected to obey, to serve, and to suffer. To a monk whose life had been spent in silence and devotion, the transformation was unbearable. The quill was replaced by the shovel, the psalm by the order of a master's shout. To a nun it was worse. Her vows, chastity, poverty, obedience to God, meant nothing now. She belonged not to heaven, but to whoever held her chain. When the longships departed, the sea carried both treasure and tears. The monks who had prayed for calm waters were now praying for storms, storms that might sink their captors before they reached shore. But the gods of the north were with their own. The ships glided swiftly across the waves, the oars rising and falling in brutal rhythm. The captives huddled beneath decks, bound and beaten if they cried out. The scent of salt, blood, and tar filled the air. Every stroke of the oar carried them farther from the world they knew, into a land of snow and stone, where even God seemed silent. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, these captives were paraded through bustling markets. Hedeby, Kaupang, Ribe, cities that would later be celebrated for their trade and art, were also centers of human commerce. Here a monk fetched a high price if he was young and healthy. He could work the fields or copy texts for a noble. A nun was rarer and valued for darker reasons. Her youth and beauty could make her a concubine. Her voice, once used for prayer, might be used now for obedience. Buyers inspected them as they would livestock, teeth checked, limbs prodded, eyes measured for strength or fear. The moment the deal was struck, their identities were erased. No one asked names, only price. The Norse saw no sin in it. Their gods demanded strength and victory, not mercy. A master's power over a thrall was total. If a slave was disobedient, they could be branded, mutilated, or killed. The sagas mention it casually, as if cruelty were as common as rain. In some households, slaves were forced to sleep outside in the cold. In others, they worked beside free men, indistinguishable except for the invisible weight of ownership. For foreign captives, those who spoke strange tongues, who made the sign of the cross, there was no hope of escape. The language, the land, and the law itself were against them. For the nuns taken from Lindisfarne and other monasteries, the suffering was beyond words. They had dedicated their lives to purity, believing their bodies were temples of God. Now those bodies were defiled, traded, and used. Their faith was the only thing they could cling to. Some prayed silently while serving their masters. Others carved crosses into wood or stone when no one watched. A few taught their captors small prayers, not as defiance, but as memory, the only thing that remained of who they once were. Imagine one of them, a woman who had spent her life copying scripture in gold and ink. Her hands, once steady and precise, now blistered from hauling water and grinding grain. The hymns she once sang were replaced by the harsh voices of men speaking a language she could not understand. She had no church, no altar, no sisterhood, only the memory of light through the stained glass of her old chapel, a light she might never see again. But even in captivity, faith endured. In secret moments, these women whispered prayers into the night, believing that though their voices could not reach the heavens, perhaps heaven still heard. They could not fight their masters with swords, but they fought with survival. With every breath, they defied the darkness that had tried to erase them. Some would never return. Others would be carried even farther, to Ireland, to Iceland, to the Baltic coasts. Their bloodlines would mingle with those of their captors, their names forgotten, but their spirit carried forward. The Norse world unknowingly began to absorb fragments of the faith it had destroyed. Crosses carved in wood appeared in Viking graves long before Scandinavia officially converted. Prayers whispered in foreign tongues echoed quietly through the north, and so, while the monks of Christendom wrote of wrath and punishment, the true miracle was happening in silence, in the hearts of the enslaved, whose endurance became the first seeds of conversion. They had lost everything, but one thing remained unbroken: belief. And from that belief, slowly, the world began to change. The Vikings learned quickly that gold fades, but people last longer. From that truth, a new kind of wealth was born: flesh. The slave trade became the hidden engine of the Viking world. After Lindisfarne, raiding monasteries wasn't just vengeance or glory. It was business. Every voyage brought back more captives: monks, nuns, farmers, even children, all chained together, all with a price. The Norse called them thralls, and across the north the markets thrived. In the ports of Hedeby, Ribe, and Dublin, human cries mixed with the noise of traders haggling over silver. Captives from Britain and Ireland filled the pens, waiting to be sold. A strong man could fetch a dozen coins, a young woman more. Some were sent east toward the markets of the Rus, others west toward the icy settlements of Iceland. For the captives, every sunrise was a sentence. They woke before dawn to grind grain, haul timber, and serve their masters' tables. The work never stopped. They ate last, slept least, and lived only at another's will. For women, especially the nuns taken from holy orders, the torment was deeper. Their bodies became currency. Some were kept as servants, others as concubines. They had once belonged to God, now they belonged to whoever owned them. Punishment came without reason. A word, a glance, even a pause could bring pain. Yet beneath the cruelty, life continued. Some slaves bore children, and those children, if their masters acknowledged them, were born free. The line between blood and bondage began to blur. Across generations, the faith and language of the captives slowly seeped into Norse life. A whispered prayer here, a carved cross there, small traces of resistance wrapped in silence. But for most, freedom never came. Their names vanished, their graves unmarked, their faith buried with them. The Vikings would remember their own heroes in sagas and runes. The slaves left no stories, only bones and whispers beneath the earth. And yet it was their suffering, unseen, unrecorded, that would quietly reshape the North. Even death offered no peace. In the lands of the North, a thrall's body had no worth beyond its final use. When they died, few were buried with honor. Their graves lay on the outer edges of the fields, shallow pits without markers, where the wind and snow erased all trace. No prayers were spoken, no bells rang. Only silence. The free were buried in mounds with weapons and jewelry. The slaves rotted in the earth as though they had never lived. Archaeologists later found the truth beneath the soil, skeletons with broken ribs, crushed wrists, and knife cuts across the neck. Some were women, their hands still bound, their skulls fractured by blunt force. It was not disease that ended them. It was ritual. In certain Viking funerals, a slave was sacrificed to follow the master into the afterlife. The Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan wrote of one such rite. A young woman drugged with drink, dressed in silk, lifted into her master's ship, and slain by the blade while men chanted around her. Her body was burned beside his, smoke twisting into the northern sky, like a plea no god would answer. To the Norse, this was loyalty. To the Christian world, it was horror beyond imagining. The monks who heard these stories saw in them proof of demonic worship, of souls damned by their own cruelty. From the fury of the Northmen, "Deliver us, O Lord," became the desperate prayer of an entire continent. Every church whispered it. Every monastery carved it into stone. It was no longer a cry for mercy. It was a warning carved into history. But history has a strange hunger for balance. The same ships that brought terror to Christian shores began over time to bring something else back with them: faith. Among the captives carried north were priests, monks, and nuns who never stopped praying, even in bondage. They whispered Latin hymns while tending fires, traced crosses in dust when no one watched, and taught their captors' children the name of a God who forgave. They could not escape, but their belief escaped through them, quietly infecting the very households that enslaved them. At first, the Norse laughed. To them, these slaves' strange rituals were harmless superstition. But as trade expanded, and Viking chieftains mingled with Christian kings, curiosity replaced mockery. Crosses began to appear beside Thor's hammers, first as trinkets, then as faith. In graves across Scandinavia, archaeologists later found both symbols buried together, amulets of protection, one pagan, one holy, laid on the same chest. It was not conversion. It was collision, the blending of two worlds born from blood. Captives who once wept in chains became the first teachers of Christianity in the north. Some chieftains married foreign women who carried this new faith like a spark hidden in the folds of memory. Others found power in aligning with the great Christian kingdoms of Europe. Slowly, one raid at a time, the destroyers of churches began to build them. The same seas that had once brought slaughter now carried missionaries, traders, and priests. The Viking Age of fire was giving way to an age of faith, forged, ironically, by the victims they had enslaved. The transformation was not sudden nor merciful. The raids continued for generations, but the seeds of change were already taking root. The very hands that had torn down crosses began one day to carve them anew. And in that quiet irony lies one of history's cruelest truths, that faith sometimes survives best when it is carried by the broken. Centuries later, the wind still whispers over Lindisfarne. The sea that once carried death now glimmers peacefully under the same northern sun. The stones of the old abbey stand half-buried, eroded by time, yet they still seem to breathe. Travelers walk among the ruins and hear only silence, but beneath that silence lingers an echo, the faint memory of chanting, of screaming, of fire. The ghosts of that June morning have never truly left. The Vikings who came for gold found more than they expected. They took treasure, they took lives, but they could not take what burned unseen: faith. The same faith they tried to destroy slowly conquered them. Within a few generations, the children of those raiders prayed to the very God their fathers had mocked. Churches rose where longships once sailed. Crosses replaced axes on northern graves. The fury of the Northmen had turned into repentance, but Lindisfarne remained more than a ruin. It became a lesson carved into time. It taught that holiness alone cannot shield the world from cruelty, that faith must walk hand in hand with strength, and that even when evil triumphs for a moment, it cannot rule forever. The monks and nuns who died or endured slavery left no grand monuments, only courage, only endurance. Their suffering reshaped a continent and reminded humanity that light, though buried, always finds a way to rise again. So when you look upon those stones, remember what they survived. Remember that peace is never guaranteed, that belief without vigilance invites its own destruction. Yet even in ruin, the spirit of Lindisfarne still stands, quiet, defiant, eternal, because faith, no matter how broken, always outlasts the sword. No empire, no weapon, no storm can ever silence belief. The Vikings burned the monastery, but not the hope that lived inside it. True strength isn't found in conquest, it's found in what endures after destruction. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Itself. Comment below. What would you have done if you stood on that beach when the dragon ships came? Your voice keeps history alive.